Good afternoon, Lawrence. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Very pleased to meet with you, Praveen.
Thank you, and the pleasure is all mine. Before we start our conversation today, I'd like to introduce you to the concept behind TwiceTold. What is it all about? So, TwiceTold, in a sense, is revisiting a book from our different perspectives. For me, from the perspective of having read it, you from the perspective of authoring it. Typically, a book gets told when it's printed for the first time. You may have had a different idea about the book when you wrote it. Your editors gave it a different spin. Perhaps some chapters were added, some were removed. Maybe the original material that you had for this book might have run into a couple of hundred pages more. But the book got told when the first advanced reader copy was issued, and then the book hit the market. The book was told to me when I read it the first time with my biases, assumptions, information, perhaps even some misinformation. But now that I'm here, sitting across from a table with you, discussing this book at length, going question by question, delving into the topics you've so extensively written about, the book will come back alive for me in a very different way. I hope that this also brings about some aha moments for you, perhaps an opportunity to discuss topics that you wanted to include in the book, but you couldn't. And the book then becomes twice told. So, giving us both a renewed experience of what this book is all about.
Sounds lovely.
Thank you, Lawrence. So, my first question is going to be, how did you come to this topic? How did you, or how, or rather, why did you decide to write about the criminal state?
Praveen, I've been writing about kind of international criminal law for a long time. It's been kind of a subject of my interest going back really probably for a couple of decades or so. And the actual impetus to really start writing this book was almost exactly 4 years ago. I was a fellow at this American Academy in Berlin, and I happened to be there on February 24th, 2022, the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And at that time, I recall that a number of jurists and commentators immediately described Putin's invasion as, the crime of aggression, as the supreme international crime. I recognize that as language going all the way back to Nuremberg. And I knew that Nuremberg's effort to kind of create a post-war edifice of international law around the crime of aggression kind of had failed. So suddenly hearing people talking about the supreme international crime again, it kind of got my juices flowing, and it became a kind of an impetus for me to kind of push the book in the direction I was doing. I was already kind of thinking about doing a book on the topic of the criminal state, but I think the fact that there suddenly was all this attention being directed to the crime of aggression again is what really then pushed me in a particular direction in the way I structured the narrative.
Understood. Now, you opened the book with an interview of Karl Jaspers in Der Spiegel in post-World War II Germany. So, could you give us a backdrop into what did post-war Germany look like, not just in everyday life sense, but also in the techno-legal sense?
hmm Yeah, this interview that took place with, as you point out, this kind of famous German philosopher, this Karl Jaspers, it takes place in 1965. And Der Spiegel, as many of us know, is probably the big German news weekly. And it really was a kind of remarkable interview. It's almost kind of inconceivable for us today to imagine devoting 16 pages of a print magazine to the interview with a philosopher. But the topic of the interview was the continuing prosecution of former Nazis in Germany. So in 1965 was a time in which Germany was, in a sense, it was experienced this so-called Wirtschaftswunder, which just means the economic miracles. So this is a country that was engaging in rapid industrialization and rapid redevelopment after the destruction of World War II. And Jaspers um, was particularly focused on not the economic reconstruction of the country, but on the continued presence within the country of really kind of thousands of people who were complicit in Nazi era crimes. And the reason that 1965 was such a critical moment was the German criminal code was controlled by statutes of limitations. Many criminal codes are controlled by statutes of limitations, meaning that prosecutors have to bring charges within a certain amount of time from the commission of a crime. Otherwise, they can no longer do so. And the statute of limitations on murder, which was the most severe crime in the German criminal code, was about to toll on all Nazi era crimes. The German statute of limitations had a 20-year tolling period or prescriptive period, as it's called, um, for murder. And so in 1965 meant that 20 years after the end of World War II, 1945, suddenly prosecutors would be unable to bring any charges against any former Nazi for anything unless the German legislature did something to extend that prosecutorial period. So that was the occasion of this kind of remarkable interview with Jaspers. And in that interview, he also kind of introduced this concept of the criminal state, which I also found very gripping and very interesting.
Understood. Now, how did the case log between 1945 until 1965 look like, at least in West Germany? What was the legal system prevailing? How much of it was controlled by the Allies? And how many of these judges and lawyers were from Nazi era Germany?
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. So basically, from 1945 until 1950, and let's just focus largely about West Germany. East Germany is a slightly different story. But if we focus on West Germany, from 45 to 1950, the legal system was under the auspices of Allied occupiers. And in the West Germany, so we're talking about France, England, and the United States. In 1950, West Germany, largely reacquires its sovereignty. And so the legal system is now reconstituted. But it does raise this kind of tricky question is who's going to participate in this legal system? And not surprisingly, the legal system ends up being populated with lots and lots of former Nazis. I mean, it's been estimated, for example, in the West German state of Bavaria, which is the largest state, both in terms of population, in terms of physical geography, that in the 1950s through the early 60s, about 80% of the judges in Bavaria were former Nazis. And this doesn't simply mean that the West Germans were a Nazi state. It just means that there wasn't a whole lot of legal talent to draw upon. A lot of these older pre-Nazi judges had been exiled or were now too old to kind of resume their positions. And so as a result of basically having no one else to draw upon, a lot of former Nazis were given high-ranking positions, actually positions all along the hierarchy of the legal system in Germany, including Nazis in the very highest courts, what we would consider the equivalent of the highest appellate court and the constitutional court of Germany.
That's horrifying to say the least. Why is it that the Allied powers, now that Germany has been under control and under Allied control, and if you may call it settlement, why not bring in justices from the United States, France, and England to manage the country for, say, a moratorium of 20 years or so? In the meantime, until Nazi lawyers not. I meant to say German lawyers and not
Yeah.
Nazi lawyers. German lawyers could come up to speed, and this international tribunal manages justice until such time that the Germans are ready to take control again, and these Nazi justices are brought to book, and this also means punishment for their complicity and enabling Nazi war crimes because they turned Nazi idea and ideology into law.
Yeah. Well, it's a very it's an excellent question, and it actually kind of goes to some of the things we even see going on in the world today, because it's really about like how long does, let's say, a conquering state want to remain as an occupier? And, and I think what we've seen in recent history is, states don't like to be occupied. And the cost of occupation can be astronomically high to the occupier. And if really what you're trying to do is create some kind of, let's say, healthy transition away from some type of fascist state that Germany was to a democratic state, having a long-term occupation isn't necessarily the best way to do it. It creates intense amount of resentment within the domestic population. And instead of becoming a tool of basically of, let's say, transitioning the domestic population into a more democratic future, suddenly becomes a tool of just creating intense hostility and resistance. And so, in many ways, the Allies were quite eager to, get out of Germany to try to both make sure that Germany would be a stable democratic order at the same time that they would be able to kind of end their occupation, sooner rather than later. Even 5 years occupation, that's still a pretty substantial amount of time. And it is interesting. I mean, the point that you make really is an excellent one because even at the time when they were reconstituting the German judiciary, the Allied occupiers basically were, yeah, we want to find judges who weren't tainted by any connection with the Nazi Party, and they just weren't able to find enough. They really were just not able to find enough untainted judges. So at some point they basically held their nose and said, okay, well, we'll try to rehabilitate the ones who seem less tainted than the most seriously tainted ones.
Understood. Now, it's one thing that West Germany did not take up the fascist path again, but if these Nazi judges were left to control the courts and judiciary, perhaps some high-ranking war criminals also survived. It's only a matter of time, perhaps a couple of decades, and then you'd have to fight this nemesis all over again. Wouldn't that be?
Yeah, I mean, that would be horrible. And I think if, um, I don't know if you've had any opportunity, Praveen, to go to Germany, but, I think Germany these days has the reputation as being a country that's been, quite impressive in confronting its Nazi past. A lot of memorials, there's a lot of education in the primary and high school level dedicated to making sense of what happened. So Germany's done a pretty good job of confronting its past. But if you look at the legal record of holding former Nazis and Nazi accessories to account, well, that legal record is not particularly impressive. And, we should be unsurprised by that, given the number of former Nazis or Nazi sympathizers who basically stopped the judiciary in the decades immediately after the war. I think the numbers are really quite striking. I think since Germany resumed its full sovereignty or its sovereignty in 1950, I think it launched about 120,000 investigations of former Nazis or Nazi accessories. That sounds like a lot, 120,000. How many actually led to successful convictions? I think that is a total over a period of, let's say, 1950 to 2026. I think that number is about 600. So we're talking about maybe a little less than 10 a year. And there were years in which basically no one was prosecuted at all. So it's not an impressive record.
There we go. I mean, call me a pessimist if you may, but I tend to look at performance, be it in the country's commitment toward democracy across the spectrum, including the judicial system and how many people have been prosecuted, because that gives you an idea of are they simply projecting an image outwardly about what they want the world to perceive them as, and how are they deep down, have they truly imbibed the lessons in their lives. Because for me, if they'd imbibed their lessons, there would be judicial remedies and punishments carried out so that you set the record clear for history that this idea or ideology will not be tolerated.
It really is. It's a very important point, and it's a point that it's something we can talk about ongoing atrocities in the world today. I mean, it is a very interesting and really fraught matter because there are other people who could come along and say that well, actually, kind of like a tactically limited legal response to a past history of atrocities is actually kind of a better tool for dealing with a transition to a healthier future because it kind of permits the people to sort of indulge in the myth that, well, we weren't really implicated in those crimes. It was just a very small number of leaders. Those were the bad people. So, there's a whole lot of myth making that goes on in history. And, we can ask, this question is whether that myth making is whether that frustrates the effort to create a kind of more healthy democratic state, or whether it actually, maybe in some cases, that kind of myth making actually facilitates it. That, if you had a more robust prosecutorial program, then you would just have a lot of people within the state rebelling against it. I think a very good example of that, to just kind of maybe move from Germany to the South African case. South Africa, when it was trying to transition away from this apartheid system to a more democratic system, it created this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It basically avoided criminal prosecutions altogether. And, there's a lot to be criticized. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission can be pretty, you know, you can really criticize that for not having fully reckoned with the crimes. On the other hand, you might say that a more full reckoning with the crimes of the apartheid regime would have led to civil war. So it's a really interesting and fraught question.
Understood. So it's a matter of confronting the violence here and now today or postponing it to the future, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Now, my next question is going to be about the definition of a criminal state.
Hmm.
What is a criminal state and who gets to call whom a criminal state?
So this term criminal state, this is something I mentioned. I came across first in this interview with Karl Jaspers that took place in 1965. And I noticed that Jaspers was not alone in using this term criminal state. The German for him is called Verbrecherstaat, just means criminal state. Um, but for example, Hannah Arendt, in this famous book of hers called Eichmann in Jerusalem, she also called Nazi Germany a criminal state. Um, there was a very well-known Italian legal thinker named Giorgio De Vecchio. He also called Nazi Germany a criminal state. So a number of people have called it that. They didn't necessarily offer a systematic theory of the criminal state. It was more kind of like a suggestive notion. But I think some of the things that they were trying to point out at what distinguishes a criminal state from, let's say, a bad regime or a criminal regime, because we've seen lots of criminal administrations around the world, and we continue to see them today. Um, but what distinguishes maybe a criminal state from a criminal regime is that, first of all, in a criminal state, basically every organ of the state has been enlisted towards criminal means. So, for example, the bureaucratic administration, and it could be even bureaucratic administrations that look like they have nothing to do with, acts of, let's say, mass atrocity, like the banking system. But the banking system has been enlisted. Things like the Interior Ministry has been enlisted. Needless to say, the military has been enlisted. And most of all, the courts and the judicial apparatus as well. So I think it's the way in which all these organs of the state have been enlisted towards facilitating and promoting the criminal ends of the state. And I think the other thing that these thinkers point to is this idea that a criminal state, maybe I could put it this way, a criminal state's not amenable to politics. And by that, I simply mean that in a bad regime or even a criminal regime, elections can still count. you can vote these criminals out of office, and hopefully, once they're out of office, you can engage in some kind of reconstruction of the administration that did bad things. In a criminal state, it seems like elections really don't count. That you really need something more like a total collapse of the state, some kind of civil, you know, some kind of civil unrest, maybe even some kind of outward, external invasion to overturn the regime. Otherwise, the regime's just kind of going to remain in place. And I think that's what distinguishes a criminal state from a bad or criminal regime, according to these thinkers.
Understood. Now, I'd like to draw your attention toward Hobbes and the Hobbesian condition of perpetual war. Now, if, according to Hobbes, if we are all governed by our emotions, namely ignorance and fear, so then who really gets to call whom a criminal? Because aren't we all acting in our own limited self-interests?
Yeah, so the Hobbes is very interesting. The reason why I think I turned to Hobbes in the book Puffing is because um, I was trying to point out to readers just how unusual the concept of the criminal state was to conventional or traditional legal thinking, legal and political thinking. And if you kind of go all the way back to Hobbes, Hobbes is this incredibly influential thinker who basically reminds us or tries to convince us that the state is really the ultimate organ of security, order, and legality. That is it's the state which basically protects us from violence. And from whose violence does the state protect us? In his most basic answer is it protects us from each other. That in the absence of a state, will engage in basically violent behavior towards one another. Now, his story, very interestingly, is a pretty secular story. So it's not some kind of story about original sin. It's not saying that people are just inherently bad or evil. Actually, it's almost what we might say is a kind of very early form of economic modeling, where he basically says if you imagine people in a system of imperfect information, that is, in which they don't necessarily know what resources are available to support their lives, they're going to engage in kind of a fearful protection of themselves. And this fearful protection of the self is I know that you're also going to engage in a fearful protection of yourself. And if I know that you're fearful about the resources that are available to support your life, then I know you might be covetous of my resources, just as I may be covetous of your resources. And so, according to Hobbes, what's going to happen is we're going to probably engage in preemptive strikes on each other. And the thing that's kind of fascinating for Hobbes is he's basically saying that's rational behavior that makes sense for us. It's a reasonable thing to try to engage in that kind of preemptive strike if I don't know if there's enough resources available to guarantee my existence, and there's no state to protect me from you. But his point is that that kind of rational response to the situation leads to incredibly irrational conditions. And those irrational conditions are what he says he describes that as the state of war. And the state of war really is, as he points out, it's a war of all against all. And the only thing that's going to protect us from this war of all against all is the state. Once we have a state, then a state can kind of create the conditions of security and order by which we can then live peaceably among ourselves, at least within the state.
Understood. Now, Hobbes's view of humanity is rather poorly sketched out. It reads so much like an Italian spaghetti, or supposing you fill in a plane with 100 chimpanzees,
Mhm.
they'd probably be at each other's throats. But if you fill in a plane with 100 perfect strangers, they're not at each other's throats. And apart from this hypothetical example, we've seen in the past as well, in throughout human history, including the discovery of the healed femur that some human cared for other humans, and this has been the bedrock on which human civilization and society has evolved. So why aren't we now discarding Hobbes and Hobbesian theory, at least from judicial practice, and looking toward a more optimistic and brighter future for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent point. And one of the things that Hobbes actually tries to say is he says, I'm not really making an anthropological account of human history. I'm really kind of engaged in a thought experiment about what will happen in the absence, in a vacuum of power. And that said, I do think that there are many conditions in the world which approach a Hobbesian state. And the famous example of the healed femur is a very nice example that demonstrates that cooperation has gone back thousands and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. On the other hand, there's been a lot of violence over that time as well. And we don't even have to go back to anthropological accounts. I think what Hobbes says is that you look at civil wars. Civil wars are the ultimate evil. And by Civil War, he's not talking about like a kind of model of the American Civil War, where you're really having kind of almost one state with, battle lines fighting another. He's talking about a complete evacuation of authority, something in which you have what we might today describe as a failed state, something like in Syria or something like that, where you have this kind of sectarian violence where no one is basically able to end the violence. And that I think it's a pretty powerful model. So, we don't, again, there's certainly anthropological understandings that challenge Hobbes, and yet there's also kind of political understandings that seem to demonstrate, at least a partial truth of what he's trying to say. And in fact, again, to kind of go back to economic modeling, these little games called, prisoners' dilemmas about how people behave in situations of imperfect information, again shows the way in which rational behavior can lead to very irrational results. And I think that's kind of the sort of model that we can kind of think about Hobbes and his continuing relevance in that regard.
Understood. Now, following up on that, if the state is the ultimate arbiter of justice, where does a state derive its potency and legality from? And if the state decides to prosecute and persecute some of its own people, where do those people then go and seek recourse?
Yeah, well, that again is that's one of the big questions, isn't it there? So so the question sort of comes down to, like, how does a state derive authority? What gives it what makes it the arbiter of security, order, and legality? And in a funny kind of way, Hobbes's answer, and it's not just Hobbes's answer, a lot of political and legal thinkers basically arrive at the same answer is, well, if the state is successful at pacifying a population, then it's a legitimate state. And Weber, this great early 20th century legal and political thinker, he basically defined the state as that body which has a legitimate monopoly on coercive violence. And again, the interesting thing about his use of the word legitimacy is he doesn't mean it's necessarily legitimate in a real moral sense. He just means that it's been successful at claiming this monopoly. And no one else, unless you have some kind of rebellion or some kind of revolution, no one else can really challenge that. And so it's kind of in a funny kind of way, and I hope this makes sense. It's just legitimacy in a de facto sense. It's just like, yeah, we say we're legitimate, therefore we're legitimate, and we have a monopoly on force. Again, not necessarily total monopoly. Obviously, there's still acts of private violence, but we get to define what is legal and what is not legal. And, from that understanding of the legitimacy of the sovereign state within the, Western political and legal tradition, there was a whole idea that, sovereign states have a prerogative to treat their legal subjects however they want without any kind of external legal scrutiny whatsoever. So if you want to impoverish or enslave your population, no other state had a right to pass legal judgment on that. It's really only kind of a, late 20th century phenomenon in which we would say, no, that's no longer the case. A state, for example, does not have the right to engage in an act of genocide against its own legal subjects. But it's kind of interesting to observe that for centuries, basically the understanding was that, yeah, a state has a absolute prerogative to treat its legal subjects how it sees fit, free of any kind of external legal scrutiny.
Understood. But how can a state prosecute any of its subjects for violating law if everyone's acting out of their own self-interest?
Well, again, it's the idea is that acting in your own self-interest isn't necessarily a horrific thing. Uh, so the classic kind of liberal legal theory is that my right to swing my arm ends at your nose. So as long as I'm not like engaging in some kind of physical harm of you, can I act in my self-interest? Sure. Can I try to make a business that makes lots of money? Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the whole free enterprise capitalist system. So pursuing your own, self-interest is actually something that the state guards and protects. It's only if uh, in trying to promote your self-interest that you start engaging in like real harm of people. Like the way I'm going to try to advance my business interest is by poisoning all my business competitors. Well, there the state says, no, you can't do that. And so, notion of self-interest isn't necessarily a threat to the state, and the state actually works to promote self-interest as long as it's not seen as kind of creating harm to the state itself or to, direct physical harm to other people. At least that's
Understood.
the theory.
Understood. Was there any opposition to Hobbes in his lifetime, or were there critics who questioned and challenged Hobbes's model and posited their own models perhaps for scrutiny?
Yeah, for sure. So there was definitely not kind of like universal agreement that Hobbes, had the right picture of the development of statehood and the power of states. I mean, if you kind of think about Hobbes's perspective, Hobbes kind of gets us into what some people have called the Hobbesian trap. Because Hobbes basically says, well, what's the way to solve the violence among you and me within a civil society? Well, create a state that will pacify us. Well, what then happens to the relationship between states? There's no sovereign that can control the relationship between states. So suddenly a lot of people observe this. People like Kant observe this, that wait a second, the violence of civil society that is pacified by the creation of the state simply gets translated to the violence between states. So now suddenly you're vulnerable to another warring state. If I'm no longer warring, vulnerable to you attacking my horde of granola, I'm now vulnerable to your army if you suddenly invade my state. And so there are a lot of thinkers. There are people like this Hugo Grotius, a very well-known figure about international law, kind of a controversial figure as well. But he comes along and says, "No, wait a second. We have to control the right of states to go to war. States can't just go to war whenever they want," which is basically Hobbes's perspective. Hobbes basically believes there's no kind of law that controls the behavior of one state vis-a-vis another state. Grotius says, no, 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 there has to be some kind of thing. Kant comes along and says, well, I'm not sure there really is any kind of law that controls the relationship between states, but maybe if we kind of create nice governments within these states, we basically solve the problem of interstate warfare. So there have been a lot of thinkers who, after Hobbes, have been kind of troubled by this whole notion of, you mean states can do whatever they want vis-a-vis other states, and have been kind of searching for ways in which we can pacify the violence between states, just as one state allegedly pacifies the violence within the state.
Understood. Now, Assuming two states go to war with each other, what justifies the first state declaring war upon the other?
Well, so from a Hobbesian perspective, from a classic Hobbes perspective, and again, that Hobbes perspective ends up having a lot of purchase through the end of the 19th century. So there are a lot of people who continue to ascribe by this perspective. According to this perspective, a state has the freedom to do whatever it wants. It has the prerogative, one of the prerogatives of the state, just as the state has this internal prerogative to treat its legal subjects however it wants, free of any kind of legal scrutiny. A state has the prerogative to go to war whenever it wants, whether it be to defend itself or simply to advance its interests or simply to conquer more territory. That's a prerogative of the state. And a lot of legal and political thinkers and statesmen continue to ascribe to that theory for, a long time. Then again, you do have these other thinkers, like someone like a Grotius, also a very well-known Swiss thinker named Vattel, come along and say, no, the state doesn't have a kind of a plenary right or prerogative to go to war whenever it wants. It can only do so in order to defend itself or to basically defend itself from attack or to basically respond to the violation of its rights. Those are the only occasions in which a state can legitimately go to war. But of course, that raises the, pretty fraught question, having, which is, well, who gets to make that determination if there's no world government or there's no kind of institution to police it? And so if you look at, Grotius and Vattel, it ultimately turns into kind of a system of self-policing. It's like the states themselves get to decide whether they're acting in their own defense or acting to vindicate the violation of some kind of right. So even though they look for some type of restraint on state war making or they'll resort to arms, I don't think they necessarily are successful. Or at least if they do find anything, it's kind of self-restraint. Self-restraint is not necessarily the most potent form of restraint that we might hope for.
Understood. Now, could you help us understand the terms jus in bello and jus ad bellum?
Yes. So these are, we always get caught up in this Latin, unfortunately. And so this notion of jus ad bellum refers to the law that controls the resort to war. So again, from Hobbes' perspective, there is no such a thing as jus ad bellum. You can always resort to war if you want to. For someone like a Grotius and Vattel, jus ad bellum refers to this notion that law dictates that you can only go to war if you're defending yourself or you're vindicating a violated right. Then jus in bello refers to the law that controls the waging of the conflict itself. So that's a very different body of law that's really separate from the law that controls the reasons to go to war. And jus in bello now looks at, well, what kind of laws actually restrain the ways in which war is waged. Things like, are there certain weapons that are not permitted? Do you have to respect flags of surrender? Things along those lines. Do you have to offer prisoners of war certain types of security guarantees? Those kinds of things.
Understood. Now, did different nations, at least in the European context, develop their own justifications for war? And if we now focus in on Germany, how did this process evolve about from Kant to Carl Schmitt?
Yeah, so it's very interesting if you get to someone like a Kant. So Kant basically has this notion. He's kind of almost a Hobbesian in the sense that he says, is there any real law that controls the relationship between states? And in contrast to Grotius and Vattel, he basically says, no, there's no law. I mean, point to me what the law is. I don't see any law that controls the states. And so then he comes along and he says, So, what is going to lead to the peaceful relations between states if it's not some kind of body of international law? Well, he says, well, maybe if each state has a nice Republican form of government, Republican forms of government tend not to go to war with each other. And so that is his solution. And he realizes that that's kind of an idealistic solution. But the idea is, we could almost put it in contemporary terms of like a lot of people say, even today, that democratic states usually don't fight against other democratic states. So that's basically his understanding. So the question is, have each state create its nice kind of form of Republican government, and this federation of Republican government will be basically a nice group that will play nicely together. Well, that raises this one question for Kant, which is what if you have a kind of outlier state? Call it a criminal state, so call it a rogue state or so, that doesn't want to make nice, that doesn't have a Republican form of government, that's kind of a predatory state. Well, according to Kant, that kind of state really needs to be basically to kind of use kind of a contemporary parlance. We need regime change for that kind of state, and regime change, would probably come through violence, and it would become, some kind of invasion or some kind of war. And you get someone like this later legal thinker, this Carl Schmitt, who I meant should, really emphasize, is a really kind of complicated and somewhat reptilian figure. I mean, he was he was not a casual Nazi. He was really kind of a Nazi legal thinker in many ways, virulently anti-Semitic character. And Carl Schmitt comes along and says, well, look at the kind of contradictions in Hobbes. Hobbes is trying to create I'm sorry, look at the contradictions in Kant. Kant is trying to create a situation in which all these states play nicely together and live peacefully together. And yet he recognizes that you have to violently eliminate the rogue state. So suddenly he is justifying a potentially extremely violent war for the purposes of eliminating the state, which perhaps represents a threat to his group of happy Republican states. And that leaves Schmitt to come along and have this kind of very unusual argument, which says basically that kind of Kantian argument for him is a dangerous argument because he thinks it's better to have, in a sense, no jus ad bellum, or to put it another way, is to say that let states go to war for whatever reasons they want because that stops a war from becoming a war of annihilation. Because according to him, if you adopt the kind of Kantian perspective, then suddenly you see a warring state or your rogue state as kind of a criminal. And once you see a state as a criminal state, then you're justified to annihilate it. And that's where a wars turn exterminatory for him. So, in a kind of peculiar way, he is an enemy of any kind of international law that controls the resort to war because he thinks it only makes war more violent, not less so. Very kind of controversial and counterintuitive position.
Understood. Now, trying to make sense of Kant, you try to see this almost a kind of a globalist tradition that republics will try to be at peace with each other, and there would be this odd rogue state that we need to come together and destroy. And then with Carl Schmitt and the entire Nazi government, you have this group of seemingly this Kantian rogues in one basket. So is it that the German state throughout its history somewhere enabled this kind of predatory thought? Or is it just coincidence that the world's most hideous gangsters and crooks of all shades of colors and stripes decided to come together at once? What seems to be making sense the most over here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it's a question that actually prosecutors and jurists at Nuremberg were really, really interested in. They were really interested in this question because, if we again go back to Hobbes, Hobbes basically says Western states are the source of order, security, and legality. Western states don't turn into criminal states. So at Nuremberg, one of the questions is not really a legal question, but it is almost as kind of this political or even philosophical, almost metaphysical question, which is, wait a second, why did Germany, this land of, to kind of use the old cliche, the land of, Bach and Beethoven, of Goethe and Schiller, why did Germany, turn into this criminal state? And so one of the things that historians and jurists start looking at is they start looking at German history and they say, well, was German history, was the German state always a little off the rails, or did it suddenly have, some kind of like major swerve in the wrong direction? And the French prosecutors at Nuremberg, interestingly enough, they actually spend a decent amount of time almost playing, teaching history lessons, or at least one version of history. And they present what's called the Sonderweg thesis. And Sonderweg just means kind of the special path. And in their argument, they argue, yeah, Germany took a wrong turn, that as opposed to, these other so-called enlightened states like Britain and France, Germany never kind of went through the Enlightenment in the same way. That Germany always had this kind of, profoundly militaristic past, and you combine militarism with rapid technological development and the absence of some kind of longer liberal legal tradition. And lo and behold, what do you get is you get the Nazi state. Now, a lot of people would dispute that. A lot of people would say, wait a sec, this Sonderweg thesis doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And but at least it's interesting to see that, how much attention was actually devoted to trying to make sense of what looked like this profoundly anomalous phenomenon, namely, why does this, seemingly civilized state turn into what we might say as, the paradigmatic rogue in human history or rogue state in human history?
Understood. Do we know if Hannah Arendt attempted some kind of Zonderweg thesis herself? Because drawing on this same idea, but also now evaluating societal characteristics, for example, obedience to law, strict obedience to law, not questioning one's elders, not questioning one's political leaders, this then eventually leading up to or building eventually a fascist state once market conditions were ripe for it. Was there some form of research done on this? Do we know something about that?
Yeah, I mean, there were actually a lot of people in focus on trying to find other explanations other than this notion that, well, Germany never had a successful enlightenment or so. People focus on questions of like the so-called authoritarian personality, or a people that has been particularly habituated to obedience. And I don't think, and there is a lot of literature about that. There was a whole book called The Authoritarian Personality. I don't think Arendt necessarily buys into that picture. That is, that the German people were particularly vulnerable to obedience to authority, as much as what she is really alert to is that if you have a complex bureaucracy within a criminal state, within some kind of totalitarian or criminal state, then what you will often have is you will have people engaging in criminal acts who never would have engaged in criminal acts if they had not been in such a state. I think in my book, I quote this one person who participated in genocide saying, I did so out of the comfort of obedience. And I think that is something that Arendt is very attuned to. This notion of, yeah, if I'm in a bureaucratic administration and the bureaucratic administration is telling me to send out welfare checks in order to keep people alive, I'll do that. If I'm a bureaucratic administration and the state is telling me to deport people to an extermination center, I'll do that too. And so I think that's one of the things that she's trying to alert us to, the way in which people's behavior, it no longer looks like a typical kind of like, criminal behavior. It looks like relatively normal people who are now facilitating acts of, mass atrocity.
Absolutely. So Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, where she's evaluating Adolf Eichmann, but where do how and rather why is it that bureaucrats such as Eichmann choose to obey the state rather than rebel against the state and say, I will not carry out these orders because they go against my conscience, and rather I would resign from duty?
Yeah. Well, that is also an excellent question. And again, I don't want to make, tendentious or inappropriate analogies to what's going on, let's say, in the United States today. I do not think the United States is remotely to be compared to the Nazi state at this moment. But you can ask, look what's going on in the Justice Department in the United States. And you can ask yourself, why aren't these people resigning? Why are they refusing to do some of these things that really look like, going after enemies of a president rather than performing their oath to the Constitution, which is what they're supposed to do. And I think a lot of it has to do with cowardice and opportunism. People fear for their careers. And this is, again, an important point to make out is, there have been people who argued that, well, the reason people obeyed in the case of something like the Nazi state was because they feared for their lives. That is not a historically accurate claim. One of the most fascinating, statistics to emerge out of all the studies that have been made of, let's say, Nazi Germany and the SS is that the number of members of the SS who suffered some kind of severe consequence for refusal to participate in, let's say, genocide, that number is exactly zero. So, could it be the case that people would be demoted? Absolutely. Might they, if you're trying to make a good career in the Nazi state, would it behoove you to opt out? Absolutely not. If you're an opportunistic person who wants to advance your career, would, obeying the law, the orders that are coming to you? Absolutely. So I think, fear and again, not fear for one's life, but just about fear for like losing one's status or losing one's job and opportunism explain a lot, goes a long way. And, we should bear in mind, this is something that Arendt points out. There were people who opted out. Interestingly enough, she estimates that about 15%, or other historians have said, about 15% of, let's say, frontline exterminators said, it's not what we signed up for. And none of them really suffered any kind of draconian consequences. But that means that 85% of people tend to, go along.
Understood. Will we ever know if these 85% of people actually enjoyed what they were doing?
Well, there have been various, studies made. There's a famous book called Ordinary Men by the historian Christopher Browning, who looked at, Eichmann was basically what we might describe as, a desktop perpetrator. He's basically someone who's picking up the phone, telling trains to deport people to killing centers. Whereas this Browning book really focuses on frontline perpetrators, frontline exterminators, people who are physically engaged in doing things like taking men, women, and children out to open air pits and just shooting them and dumping their bodies into these mass graves. And, one thing that he points out is, some people, a small percentage are, sadists and seem to kind of enjoy it. Another not insignificant percent become just inured to it. Even if they were found it, kind of disgusting or something objectionable to begin with, they just kind of become inured to it. And they become inured to it. I mean, again, it's a frightening thing, but they become inured to it much in the way that, let's say, you had a bunch of cattle that had, hoof and mouth disease and needed to be destroyed. People would go ahead and destroy those cattle. So they just become inured to kind of what they're doing.
Understood. Now, moving on from the Nazi state and moving back toward Napoleonic wars
Mm.
and that era, this term that enemy of the state, that were enemy of the people, that Britain and its allies called Napoleon Bonaparte, was this a kind of a novel new tradition that was beginning to form, or did we see similar accusations fly about even in the past, perhaps even in the 30 Years' War?
So there is this term, again, we're back to our unfortunate reliance on Latin, but we have this term, this hostis humani generis. And the hostis humani generis just basically means the enemy of all humankind or the enemy of all mankind. And it's a term that actually, interestingly, was first applied to pirates. Pirates were basically kind of thought of as sort of to kind of go back to some of these categories that we were talking a little about in the context of Hobbes. So, according to Hobbes, the people who break the law of the state internally, those are criminals. The people we fight, those are enemies. Enemies aren't committing any kind of crime because there is no international law, according to Hobbes and people like Kant. Um, but then there was this kind of like in between category of the pirate. And the pirate, the so-called enemy of all humankind, was sort of like both an enemy, like a military enemy, but a criminal at the same time. So it was both like a criminal, we can almost call him a criminy or something like that. So kind of having both the qualities of someone who was violating some kind of law, some kind of like um, almost basic law of humankind, and also someone that we could use military force against. But then when you deal with someone like a Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, so after he is finally captured, remember he's captured basically twice. First, he's sent off to Malta. That doesn't work too well. He kind of escapes, kind of can leads the French army back to battle. Then he's defeated again and taken prisoner. Uh, but this is where you start getting in these problems with this doctrine of sovereignty that had such a kind of pull on diplomats and statesmen and thinkers at the time. The idea was, wait a second, he was a sovereign. So what law can we apply to a sovereign? Um, and they're really stuck. They're basically saying, like, we don't really know what to do with this guy. We can kind of almost act as if he's like some kind of world pirate, like the enemy of all humankind. But he wasn't really a pirate because he was leading a state. So, what do we do with him? Can we try him? And the idea was there's really no law that authorizes us to try him. Remember, we're back to this notion about sovereigns having these prerogatives, and the prerogatives are I can treat my own the way I want, and I can go to war when I want. And so, what the English basically do is they basically say, yeah, we don't know what to do with him, but we'll call him a threat to security, and we'll just put him in this island of Saint Helena, and we'll just let him live there for the last 20 years of his life or so, and a little less than that. And um, in a sense, they treat him almost what we might describe this as kind of permanent detention. We don't know what to charge him with. There's no available crime. So we'll just kind of detain him, calling him a security threat to basically the entire world. So it is this almost kind of state of permanent detention that he experiences at St. Helena. But again, it's because of the unavailability of any real international criminal law that any state could appeal to for the purposes of bringing criminal charges against Bonaparte.
Understood. Now, may I also note that Bonaparte was prosecuted perhaps because of his rather humble origins, born to some long gone Corsican nobility, and he was not a member of any existing royal family. Whereas in the wars that followed immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, Tsar Nicholas I was not exiled in any meaningful way, nor were any other European monarchs punished or even sent into exile for that matter. So why is it that the law chooses to attack only plebeians?
So I think I would push back a little about that, Praveen, because first of all, as I said, Nap Napoleon, he's never prosecuted. So it's not that he's prosecuted and suddenly Nicholas II is kind of left untouched. I think it is the case that as opposed to Nicholas II, I think Napoleon was considered, maybe I could put it this way, such a global headache that, basically England was like, we're sick of dealing with this guy. Prussia's sick of dealing with this guy. Even France, on certain level, is sick of dealing with him. And so the idea is that's why we're going to kind of create this sort of limbo status of permanent detention and call him like a threat to the security of all humankind. Nicholas II is, well, then we're just right back to the normal world of sovereignty. He's a sovereign. He can do what he wants. There's no law that basically bars him from doing that. So it's not necessarily the fact that he has some kind of nobility by birth. I think it's simply more the fact that Napoleon was considered something of an outlier, that he was this global headache in a way that Nicholas II never was. And so when it comes to someone like a Nicholas II, the more standard respect of sovereign prerogative kicks in. And in the case of Napoleon, these great powers were willing to kind of make an exception and say, no, we got to deal with him in some other way.
That's interesting. I was thinking perhaps with England and Russia fighting each other through their shadow proxy war, the great game, the kind of consternation and disruption to global politics as well as trade that it caused, did it not make the Prussians, perhaps the the Confederation of German States, also label either England or Russia as global headaches, given that they had been fiddling with each other and meddling world trade while there was money to be made for these other states. So curious that how come neither of these were also similarly labeled, if not prosecuted?
Well, again, so one of the things is that let's bear in mind with Napoleon, Napoleon has been defeated and seized, right? So he's actually kind of leading an army and he's been taken captive. Um, and I'm sure it is the case also that when we start talking about this concert of Europe or the great powers that emerge in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, are they all lovey-dovey with each other? Absolutely not. Certainly, there are hostilities between these powers, but basically, I think the idea is that they will try to at least deal with those problems through some kind of diplomatic means or some kind of creation of alliances to deal with, let's say, to use your phrase, or this notion of the headache that one represents to the other. But I think the idea of dealing with it through some kind of legal means, that would have been just like, I think if you had brought that up at the time, people would go like, what on earth are you talking? What legal means? There are no legal means for dealing with these things. The ways of dealing with alliances, diplomacy, but there's no law that basically controls the relationship, or at least no criminal law. I mean, there might be an international law that controls the relationship between states, but that international law certainly does not control heads of state. And it certainly doesn't create any kind of criminal exposure for heads of state. That's totally unthinkable. And the idea is like, we would find that abhorrent because, on some level, even if we're headaches to each other, we're still part of the same club. And that club recognizes these reciprocal prerogatives.
Understood. That helps make a lot of sense. Now, speaking about just wars or laws that concern conduct in wars, do we know if these underwent revisions following developments in methods of warfare or improvements in weapons? For example, now with creations of weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of maybe jumps forward a little bit, but this whole notion of, for example, so remember, just war theory goes back to this notion of not the way in which war is being waged, but the occasions for going to war. So just war theory might say something like, again, if I am acting my self-defense, then I am justified to engage in an act of war. Whereas, let's say, just war theory would say, if I'm just trying to seize the booty or land of another country, that's not an adequate justification. Um, I think your question asks, and it's a very important question, is does the changing nature of armament and technology change the very equation for the justification for going to war? And probably the most dramatic example of that is things like with nuclear weapons. Like, do nuclear weapons, does that kind of change? Like, on what circumstances is the use of nuclear weapons allowed, even if, let's say, you are engaging in an act of self-defense? And that becomes, I think, a really fraught thing. I think a lot of people would say, never. You can never use nuclear weapons. Of course, then there are even these things like, these tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, as opposed to these, massive city destroying, so-called strategic weapons, very different kind of thing. And, the interesting thing about both the kind of just war theory and even uh, the law of kind of the law and customs of war, that is, the law that controls what we might say today describe as the law of armed conflict. Law of armed conflict basically prohibits certain types of bullets, for example, expanding bullets, which cause unnecessary grievous wounds, but it doesn't ban nuclear weapons. So you again, it's this kind of, this contradiction within the field, and you find lots of contradictions and within the field of the law of armed conflict, I'm afraid.
Understood. And my last question is going to be about whether we have a law or a series of laws for prosecuting nations that instigate wars of attrition. Do we?
Well, I don't think even now today, if we talk about the field of international criminal law, the field of international criminal law basically is comprised of four crimes and four crimes only. It's war of aggression, launching a war of aggression, war crimes, that is, violating the laws of armed conflict, crimes against humanity, which is kind of systematic attacks on a civilian population, and genocide. And genocide is basically the attempt to destroy a group or members of a group, qua group, that is, as a group. That basically is the entire field of what we would now describe as international criminal law. Now, that field of international criminal law applies to members of a state. It doesn't apply to states themselves. So you don't prosecute a state for engaging in genocide. You can prosecute, let's say, the head of state for having authorized or ordered genocide. Um, Now, there are avenues in which you can kind of hold a state responsible for an act of genocide and sue, for example, for some kind of monetary damages or some kind of uh, statement that the state has engaged in this criminal act. That's something that takes place before the International Court of Justice. International Court of Justice is basically a civil court that regulates the relations of states, and it's an organ of the United Nations. That's in distinction to the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court, that could try, let's say, a head of state who was responsible for engaging, ordering, let's say, a war of aggression, ordering acts that constitute crimes against humanity, organizing acts of genocide, war crimes, that kind of thing. And so, there certainly are organs and relevant law nowadays that would authorize those type of prosecutions. But as we've seen, it's very, very difficult to hold, in particular, powerful states to account. It is much easier to hold weaker and more vulnerable states to account for engaging in, let's say, violations of international criminal law than it is to hold powerful states. And I think that's just a regrettable reality that describes the system as it's presently constituted.
Understood. So, despite all these intervening centuries between us and Hobbes, we continue to operate within the Hobbesian paradigm and paradox.
Well, maybe I would just say maybe the one kind of challenge I would make to that description, Praveen, is to say, to use the old metaphor of the glass half full or the glass half empty. At the time of Hobbes, the glass was empty, period. Now the glass is like 1/10 full. And we could say maybe a glass that's 1/10 full is better than a glass that's completely empty. And maybe in the coming decades, we'll see it 2/10 full or something like that.
Absolutely. I'm happy that I completely agree with you that the class is at least one tenth full. The fact that you've authored a book questioning this how and why, the fact that this exists gives me hope that if we ask the right questions, eventually we will come to the answers. The answers themselves are not material as much as the fact that we ask questions and these questions then become parliamentary debate or debates at the Senate and drive policy.
Exactly. I share that view completely.
Thank you for authoring this book, Lawrence. This was a fantastic read. I look forward to speaking with you again on the second part of our conversation. This time, I would like to get into the nuances of genocide and details of how the Nuremberg trials were carried out, as well as the trials for of war crimes committed by Japan.
I look forward to continuing our conversation. Really great conversation, Praveen. Thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you again, Lawrence, for authoring this book. Take care and talk to you soon.
Looking forward to it.
Bye bye.